so much. Thanks to Mobile Consultations and Laura for putting on this really awesome conference. It's so nice to be in a room of like-minded people who will go forward and carry the conservation flag later on. So what I'd like to do is share a little bit about the almost 2 decades of work that I've been doing, looking at how we get wildlife onto private lands and we really just make room for wildlife on the landscape. And when we think about wildlife on private lands, for many people, the wildlife connections that they have on private lands are really the more common species, the species that we see every day at the bird feeders, or they're maybe adapted to humans. But when I'm thinking about wildlife, and hopefully when you all are thinking about wildlife, we're thinking about the many, many species that are across our landscape, from Hudson Valley, the Adirondacks, and all of the different places. There's a lot of wildlife that rely very much so on private lands. And so what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about why we actually need to plan specifically for wildlife, how we might be able to influence the planning process to benefit wildlife. Then I'll give us some examples of where we can improve different conservation ordinances with information from the wildlife science. And then finally, a couple of examples from the Staying Connected program on how we engage local communities in this process. So my experience is mostly working in these low density development areas. I think probably many of you are familiar with them. It's like a single house per 5 to 40 acres. These are typically on large lots. And one of the defining characteristics of these low density areas is that when a development happens, a lot of the open space is actually retained. And so it looks very similar whether you're in a temperate forest in the eastern US or out west in kind of a sagebrush sea. When the development is there, you still have the feel of a lot of open space. And so a lot of people often say to us, well, why do we need to plan for wildlife? We've got all this open space, like you must be crazy, there's like so much there. But the reality is that when many protected areas were set up, they do a really good job of protecting rocks and ice and high elevation landscapes, but they actually do a less good job of protecting some of the more productive habitats that are down in the lower elevations that have a lot of the food resources that wildlife use. And it's not that surprising that both wildlife and people, we are mammals after all, like to occupy the same types of habitats. And so you have this kind of tension on the private lands. After 15 years, 20 years of working on these topics, looking at our research lessons, we found that some of the biggest lessons that we've learned is that the size of the impact from development is actually much, much larger than the physical footprint. I think we heard one of the speakers talk about that today. In our own research, we're looking at a 200-meter radius around a house and away from a road that wildlife can actually recognize that that infrastructure is there. So it's like a 30-acre circle around a house. We've also done research to show that these changes happen very, very quickly. 1 year you can measure it, the house comes in the next year, you can detect a change the year after that. We've also looked at this across many taxa and across many geographic areas, and so we see these changes happen not only in the forested systems, but also in the grassland systems and the heterogeneous systems. And basically what we're seeing is this like simplification of the biota that are on the landscape. And we'll have our poster child of the day, Scarlet Tanager. We're basically trading birds like these forest interior species for the more common species. And I like to think of it as something similar to when we think of a little downtown with a lot of independently owned businesses, and then a big box store comes to the outskirts of town. Like, not every single one of those independent businesses closed down, but you kind of have this like anywhere America feel and a homogenization of kind of the society. And this is actually what's happening in our landscapes, both in our landscapes for wildlife, both in urban places and all the way out to these low density areas. So another reason why we plan for wildlife is because people actually like wildlife. And when you ask them about growth and development, they kind of are like, yeah, that doesn't really go together. And when you talk about, say for example, restrictions that would benefit wildlife or guidelines that would benefit wildlife, there's generally pretty strong support that it's okay to have those types of things on the books for the benefit of wildlife. I'm a social scientist, so we like to kind of switch the words around. The word regulation is kind of a hot button word. It doesn't get as much support, but I think it kind of gives us guidance as to like how we need to kind of craft our messages about what we're doing for benefiting wildlife. One example that I'd like to share from Australia, this is where people actually pay a lot of money to go and live in a development where they support wildlife. This is a Koala Beach housing development. It's relatively new, but the people who live there have to go through a very rigorous interview process. They have to agree to very stringent regulations about what types of activities they can do around their house and what's allowed. Every single tree is mapped that the koala bear uses for their food, and so it's this kind of new way of thinking about how to both coexist with wildlife on the landscape. The thing about what happens here, we might have a development that is named after the species that were at the site at one time, but those might not be there anymore, and maybe we should consider renaming our developments for what they actually are, or for the process, that land use process that we're putting them in that kind of configuration. And so speaking of the process, I like to think about how we actually go through the different land use planning process and where we can actually influence that process to improve the situation for wildlife. So just as a reminder, you guys are all familiar with this, but when somebody buys a parcel, the first thing they might do is kind of review the title and make sure it's all clean, and then they might go to the regulations, be like, okay, what can I do on this land, what's going to be legal, and then they might hire a consultant, and that consultant will help them come up with some conceptual designs and maybe put the plan forward to the governing body in the town. And then if it's a little bit controversial, maybe there's a public hearing or some public comments, but generally speaking, it'll kind of move through, receive approval, and then the next thing you know, you have buildings on the landscape. So where in that process can wildlife actually be integrated into the program? We think that there's kind of two main areas. One is within the regulations, and another is kind of at the public hearing area, and I'll talk a little bit about both of those, but first the public hearing. Probably many of you have been involved in those. It can be a little bit after the fact. The developers put a lot of money in, the houses are already maybe ready to go, maybe some people are lined up to buy them, people are getting a little anxious, and the lawyers ask really uncomfortable questions. Is this development going to change life on Earth as we know it? It's not really the best time to kind of bring up wildlife and bring them into the picture. So we actually spend a little bit more time thinking about, how can we influence that regulatory structure and all the different pieces. Regulations are hot button words, so we have to be careful. But regulations kind of can include all the different pieces, like the state enabling legislation, model tool language, comprehensive plans, and also the ordinances that give those some teeth. So I'll give you an example of conservation development, which can also be known as cluster development or subdivision development or conservation design. And this is a type of ordinance that is used for improving the design and the stewardship of a parcel of land by kind of situating the natural areas, or protecting those, identifying those natural areas, and then situating development with them. That's some of the things that other speakers have talked about today. So we looked at conservation development across the U.S. and did an analysis. We looked for all the regulations in 11 western states, and then we did 4 northeastern states. Only we just concentrated on northern New York, not southern New York, sorry guys. But we found that about a third of regulations have some sort of conservation development on the books. And that when we look at the process of those over time, we can see an increasing rate of adoption. In the last decade especially, we see a lot of new conservation development on the books. And also we noted that a lot of these conservation development ordinances have to go through a revision process or get updated in some way, on average every 5 years. Once we amassed all of those ordinances, we then looked at a number of different criteria, such as what is the mean amount of land that's required to be protected in the conservation ordinance. In the Northeast, it was about 40%. In the West, it was about 60%. We also looked at whether or not these ordinances required a site analysis for the natural features on the land to be completed. This is quite low, less than 20 in the Northeast, less than 15 in the West. We also looked at within those, is the site analysis actually required before you place the buildings on the land? Not really a prevalent process. So as we heard earlier, that's not the ideal. Then we also looked at whether the design of the conservation development requires some sort of consultation with an ecological expert. In the Northeast, the numbers were a little bit higher than the West, so we kind of dove into that a little bit more, and we realized that actually the consultation is just with the planning board, and in the very low-density rural communities where we work, those planning boards are often volunteer, and they tend to not have that biological expertise right on. The volunteers just don't have it. So it was kind of an interesting analysis, and it really pointed to some of the great opportunities that we have within this kind of ordinance process, that because they're being adopted kind of rapidly now, or they're being updated, there's definitely a way to integrate some of the new, more current science into the process. And we also recognize that it's really weak in terms of the actual biological benefits that may be accrued from these developments based on all of the criteria. We had like probably 50 or 55 things that we were looking for. So then the question is, well, what really needs to change from a biological perspective? So that prompted us to host a workshop where we brought biological experts from across the country. It was a very small group of us, like 10 or 12 people, and we got together and kind of went through, what are the different recommendations that we would put forward within the land use planning process. And we spent like 3 days kind of brainstorming and thinking through and how we could integrate wildlife science into different processes. So those 6 overall topics were some of the areas, and I'll just note that we did have a kind of a sustainable construction, somebody mentioned that earlier, and also kind of the stewardship and education management of the lands going forward. And so that document is in draft form, but it's shareable, but we're going to kind of polish it up soon. Then we also took those biological recommendations, and we thought, well, is it realistic? And I hear a bunch of scientists getting together. Let's see what community practitioners would think of these biological recommendations and how we might actually suggest some revisions to ordinances that are out there on the books based on those biological recommendations. So we hosted a second workshop in the Northeast to generate some revision language. And basically we went back to our database that we had amassed of the Northeast regulations, and we looked at what are the most prevalent tools. And they include conservation development and also overlay districts. And then we went through and found examples of those conservation development ordinances and overlay district ordinances, and both model tools and actual documents that are being used by communities. We went through those line by line, basically, and said, what elements would we want to keep now based on these biological recommendations? What would we drop? And what would we, more importantly, add based on what's new? And so we worked for a number of days. We kind of did a bunch of cut and paste and arts and crafts projects to kind of develop these composite models, which we're now, we have it all compiled into a technical report, but we'd like to move it to the next step of actually completing the model ordinances so we can share those out with people like you, probably. So it's nice we have a lot of kind of scientific background, and we have this process information. We can create like some static documents. Maybe some of you saw the brochures that we had out in the front called Make Room for Wildlife. I'm not sure if there's still some left. But those are static, and so what we really need to think about is how we engage and how we get into that public process, which we clearly there's a lot of that going on in this room. So I'm sure you are all very well familiar. But one of the things that we looked at is this collaborative conservation action model, which comes from my collaborators at Cornell University. And this is a process we're looking at. How do you take a group of people, and what elements do you need to actually get to some sort of conservation outcome? Not surprisingly, you need to build the relationships and have a lot of dialogue. You need to have the right kind of people in the room who have some sort of authority or legitimacy to make changes. And then you need the capacity in terms of funding and labor. So we were interested in what does it actually take to get something adopted, an ordinance adopted by a community, and then actually implemented. So we went back to our database of regulations that we found, and we kind of picked out strong places that had relatively strong ordinances, and by that I mean that they had some objectives that were clearly about conservation, that they had a quantitative requirement for the public space that was greater than 50%, that they required a site analysis, and that they also required a management plan for the open space once that was created. And so we didn't find any communities that met all 4 of these criteria, but some of them met 3. So then we went back to those communities, both in the West and in the East, and did interviews with people who were involved in these planning processes to see if we could find any themes. And what we really heard was that it depended a lot on there being a strong motivation in the community, and that motivation might have been related to a development threat either in the community or very often kind of in the next neighboring community. And they also, whether there was a strong desire to protect some sort of rural character, maybe for economic purposes or people took a lot of pride in their rural character. The other motivation was that the state actually had a requirement for revising or updating their codes. And so when that happened, we very often saw stronger language because maybe there was a model tool that was on the books and then the community would be like, okay, we just got to adopt that. But the challenge with that is that those tended to not be implemented unless it was accompanied by a much stronger sense of capacity. So some technical experts, people like you who are more familiar with the outcome that we're desiring, those people had to be engaged and actually facilitating some sort of productive dialogue with the local communities in order for it to actually get implemented. And so this kind of sums it all up. One of the people said, like, one of the things that the town does well is they sit down with you early on in the process, they discuss how you're fitting into the town, and it makes you think a little bit more outside of the boundary, the property lines, makes you consider linkages, natural open space, and pathways. So that was kind of a pretty revealing quote right there. In terms of the collaborative action model, what this tells us is that there's actually, it's very true, you need a lot of dialogue. You also need the capacity, and I think that capacity is kind of in the form of trained people who understand kind of the science and can speak to the conservation benefits of these ordinances, but also the need to have a little bit stronger model regulations that may be taken up by local communities. But also it's finding those communities that have that motivation. If you're having to prioritize where to work, prioritize a place that's maybe facing a development or has this requirement in their state enabling legislation to do a periodic update. So yeah, you need the conditions of motivation and capacity and productive dialogue to get these things adapted and working on the ground. So we thought that was good. It was helpful to kind of have a roadmap for action and for engagement, both for improving those model ordinances, training the trainers, connecting with the motivation, and I'll give an example of our community engagement that we used quite widely throughout the Staying Connected partnership that you saw the video of. And this was our community values mapping approach. And this approach, it's very similar probably to many participatory approaches that you guys have used, but what we did specifically is when we went into communities and worked with them, we asked them to come up with a list of all the diverse interests in their communities and let's get them to a workshop, of course using food to entice people there. Then we brought big maps of the community and markers, we like arts and crafts projects, and we asked people just a simple question: what do you value about your community? They would go and circle the different polygons and give us a little detail about what was in those polygons, and what we were able to do is then map that on GIS, and there are a bunch of different values, whether they're cultural or economic or hunting and fishing, traditional resource management. We then could show those communities these maps either by single value or by looking at the multiple values together, so that there might be places that in these warmer colors where there's multiple values intersecting. Perhaps those are places of tension, perhaps those are places where we need to think a little bit more cleverly about how to actually protect the values for that community. By engaging with the community, it tended to lead to action, so a lot of those maps ended up getting put right into the comprehensive plans, which is a really important thing, because then it's something that can be relied upon in the future. We've also worked in terms of engaging, going back to some of the other science, with the Adirondack Park Agency to say, put all new development within the ecological impact zone, that 200-meter area, and try not to spread that ecological impact zone out across the landscape. So how do we engage? We really need to build a community of practice. Somebody mentioned it's really hard to work with communities, and it is. So that's why we need lots and lots of people. That's why it's very exciting that you're all here today. So we really have to commit long term, and that's when we start to get a paradigm shift. One of our planners who came to one of our workshops was like, this is totally a different way of approaching, like really thinking about where the natural resources are on the landscape and then integrating it right into the existing regulations and process. So it's not the end. We know that wildlife need private land. We know that it's not just plain old open space that matters, but how that open space is operating. It's not simply enough to just have open space. And we really need a lot of people out there. It's just the beginning. We're starting to really understand the wildlife science and the role that it can play within the landscape process. So we need to keep moving forward on that. So I'd like to just say thanks. I don't stand here by myself, having done all of this work. I have a lot of collaborators and funders, and hopefully we can all work together so we can avoid pictures like this kind of cartoon. And I really appreciate your time and the process for coming to talk here. Thank you.